Welcome, everyone, to our live broadcast for Raise the Roof, where we're hoping to present different worldview ideas, test them through some thoughtful and winsome dialogue. This is our 5th episode of our 7-part series based on Modern Ethics and 77 Arguments, a Stone Reader. That's a book that was published originally was a New York Times series written by a series of atheists. Today I'm joined by my Christian co-host, Leroy Hill, and of course our atheist guest, Richard Suttles, also known as the Fallen Atheist. We're going to tackle Anna Srinivasan's challenge to what she considers the immorality of the free market. So we're going to explore this question: in a system that denies God, can atheism navigate economic justice? So with that, gentlemen, welcome. How are you doing today? Any news exciting? What's going on?
I'm sitting in the car. Nothing exciting.
All right, Richard, we'll come to you. Maybe you got something interesting to tell us.
I'm enjoying this. This is our 5th show. And I don't know if we ever talked about how long we've known each other and how cool this is. But yeah, I'm just happy to be here. I'm happy this is our 5th show and that you and I are both Arizona people. And
that's right.
We agree on a lot of the same things. Yeah, so I'm just happy to be here.
Yeah, well, it's good to see you. So I think I told this story once a long time ago, but Richard, when I moved to Arizona from San Diego, he was connected through me on social media, as he is to apparently every Christian who is out there doing any kind of apologetics work. And he said, "Hey, I'll help you move in." And I thought this was weird, like a creepy internet stalking dude. And I'm like, "No, I'm good, man. I'm good." I'm like, I think I texted, maybe I even texted Leroy. I said, "There's this atheist guy that says he wants to help me move into my house." I'm like, I don't know if I want somebody on social media to know where I live. So turns out that Richard's an okay dude. He was just a genuine offer. So that was pretty cool.
I'm just a Georgia boy through and through. Even though I'm in Arizona, I'm still a Georgia boy. So if there's something heavy to lift, I should go help lift it.
All right. Okay, well, let me do a quick intro to the show, what today is all about. So today we're talking about atheist economics, the morality of atheist economics. And by that, there isn't one solution, one answer. And so Richard's going to get to, even though we're talking with Srinivasan's viewpoint here, even she compares 2 different atheist models or approaches to this, and she falls somewhere else. So it's not to suggest that Richard's responsible for her views or how they are, but we do want to dialogue about how can atheists explain economics and talk about these concepts of justice. And I think it's pretty timely considering we're in the midst of a lot of dialogue. We've got Mamdani in New York and the Democratic Socialists of America pretty much taking over the Democratic Party, and they at least a massive influence there. And a lot of their dialogue is about economic justice. So this is pretty timely as far as that goes. Now, the framework we're doing is through Anna Srinivasan. I'm going to butcher her name throughout, so I apologize. And she has an argument in that Stone Reader we talked about. And I want to give a little bit of background on her because I think it's pretty relevant to our dialogue. She's a philosopher, a public intellectual. There's a lot of her bio I put together here. She considers herself a public intellectual, an author whose work focuses on political philosophy, epistemology, feminist theory, ethics, and social criticism. She was born in India, or born to Indian parents, rather. She studied philosophy at Yale University before earning her bachelor's and doctorate in philosophy at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. So she's got the, brilliant bona fides there. She teaches at Oxford. She teaches on political theory there, and she's a fellow at All Souls College, and she is proud to tell us that she's the first non-European person of non-European descent to hold that chair. And so her first book was The Right to Sex, Feminism in the 21st Century. That was published in 2021. And that actually, the reason I did that bio is that her view on feminism and sex and economic justice will come into play. And we're going to dialogue about that a little bit too in this view that she presents. So what is her article about that we're looking? And you can find the link in our show notes if you want to check that out and read the article if you haven't had a chance to read it ahead of time. So anyway, Srinivasyan's argument is that the contemporary debates about economic justice are largely shaped by two competing atheist political philosophies. So basically, she's starting with two atheist philosophies, saying those are the two ideas that she wants to compare. Doesn't have any other external influences, which is an interesting take, but okay. The first was developed by atheist John Rawls in 1971 book, A Theory of Justice. Rawls begins with fairness and asks how society should be organized so that inequalities benefit the least advantaged. He, at least in Srinivasyan's view, and I say that because she is not an economist educated. She's a philosopher. She teaches on political theory. None of us here are economists. We're not doing economics 101 in this. And I did at least enough view that I don't know that she fairly presents these views. I don't even know enough to know to critique her for that. I read some pushback, but we're not going to get into that. I'm just going to assume that her take on all of these views is accurate. We're just going to assume that she is a fair broker of these economic systems, okay? Because we're more concerned with the ideas that she's offering as what is truth and justice, okay? So just need to make that qualification. So if anybody chimes in later, oh, that's not a fair view of Rawlsian philosophy, I was like, well, fine, that's her view, take it up with her. Writer at Oxford. Anyway, so the inequalities, she said, he maintains that social and economic inequalities are justified only when they benefit the least advantaged members of society, as I said. Therefore, Rawls is willing to limit economic freedom to achieve greater fairness. The second system of economic justice she talks about is articulated by atheist Robert Nozick. In his 1974 book, Anarchy, State, and the Utopia, Nozick begins with liberty and asks how society can respect individual rights without coercion. He defends a strong individual rights, voluntary exchange, and a minimal state. Therefore, in Srinivasyan's opinion, Nozick is willing to tolerate substantial inequality in order to protect freedom. So in short, this is the summary of her ideas. Srinivasyan believes that the choice is between Rawlsian system that asks what distribution of social capital is just, and a Nozickian system which asks how was the social capital acquired. So it's two different philosophical, ethical questions that lead to different systems in her view. So to evaluate the morality of these two approaches, Srinivasyan presents four questions that she believes expose the grave moral problem with Nozick's libertarian framework and with generally capitalism in general. Again, I suspect here she's also rejecting what's called the Rawlsian original position and the veil of ignorance, which I'm not going to explore those too much in this, but I'm just throwing those out for those that really care about economics and want to go more deeply, because both of those ideas assumes morality can be determined irrespective of one's social location and identity. That should be familiar to all of us who've studied critical theory. In other words, she's arguing that your standpoint, your experience determines the moral justice of the economic system, there is no such thing as an independent system. So when Rawls might ask what rules would people choose under these fair conditions, Srinivasyan asks, how have certain groups been privileged by the system? Or in Barack Obama's, some of you might remember this, he talks about the winners of life's lottery. That's how he views the people that are successful. And I think Srinivasyan falls within that framework. And what do the privileged owe the most vulnerable people is this other question she asks, who are oppressed by that same system. So again, to answer that question, Srinivasyan appeals to what she calls the common sense morality that looks at each person's circumstances and concludes that, quote, rejecting the Nozickian worldview requires us to reflect on what justice really demands rather than accepting the conventional wisdom of that market can take care of morality for us. Thus, she believes, points to the superiority of a more Rawlsian approach to economic justice where morality, the distribution of all resources, is managed by the state. Okay, that's as simple as I can make it, but Richard, how do you think I unpack that system? Where do you see that maybe at play? What's your take on her assessment of those ideas? We'll get into her four questions, by the way. I'm going to pose each of those four questions to you and then to Leroy. You'll give your worldview answer to those questions. But just as a whole, summarizing her view, any thoughts on that?
Yes. And for anyone who's just tuning in and you've heard a bunch of weird hard to pronounce names.
Yeah.
Don't worry about any of that. All you got to think about is this, is if you have a nation of people and one presidential candidate says, all that matters is consent. If two people agree to it, then they can just do that. They come up with their own price, leave them alone, stop bothering them. Another presidential candidate says no, because you're going to have a bunch of wealthy, powerful people and then a bunch of poor people. We need to constantly focus on those poor people and then make sure that they're taken care of. So we don't let these big, powerful people keep messing with these poor, impoverished people. Those are your two ideas. Forget the names. Nothing else matters. I'm going to argue that neither of those great ideas. There's probably going to be a much more nuanced answer to that, but just keep those two ideas in mind. Just consent no matter what, or take care of the poor no matter what. And I think both of those sound great, but they also provide bigger problems too.
Richard, I think that's really good because I was just listening to today some clips from Ben Shapiro, or Ben Shapiro is presenting them from different socialist things, Bernie Sanders versus what's the Fox News guy that you now is independent? What's his name? I can't.
Is it Tucker Carlson?
Yeah, Tucker Carlson. Yeah, it's Tucker Carlson.
Okay.
And it's interesting because Carlson and you've got the socialist sort of Marxist wing of things, sort of that horseshoe idea kind of coming together a little bit in that other framework that's like, hey, the system is rigged, it's all unjust. And so we've got to have the state redistribute in some way. Now, they may agree on what that distribution looks like, but the state must intervene is sort of their argument, take that sort of approach. So these things get really messy and muddy in that. And so we're going to try to do our best to unpack the morality of that and see where our Christian worldview versus the atheist worldview impact. Okay, Leroy, we got you back. Hopefully we can hear you. Any thoughts?
Can you hear me?
Yep, hear you now.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
You're breaking up a little bit, but let me just jump in and just kind of summarize that. Hopefully people heard all of that. But yeah, you're right. There's going to be people who don't succeed and people who fail in any economic system. And anybody else that says that is selling you something. And I think, Richard, we would all agree with that. So a lot of people that are selling, the perfect system that we enter this utopian reality where nobody is left behind. I mean, that's a great ideal. And I think Christians and even atheists could say we love that system. But the problem is it doesn't exist anywhere and never has and never will. And so just simply pointing out inequality not necessarily mean a system itself is evil. It just means that those are realities that we all face. So we have to say, if that's the case, should anybody succeed? What determines success, and how much of finances, would be considered fair or unfair? And then we get into these squishy ethical terms. So I think that's an excellent insight from Leroy. So I'm vamping a little bit here, Leroy, hoping your audio clears up a little bit. But let's jump into the 4 questions that Srinivasian asks, and this will help try to keep things as simple as possible. So again, Richard, I'm going to challenge you to give your own atheist answer to Srinivasian's 4 questions. Leroy's going to give with a Christian worldview response. And again, I'm not assuming here there is a single atheist or a single Christian response. I'm just saying, hey, we're based on our worldview commitments and all the things we've explored. How would we try to answer these? And in our answer, can we have consistency in our answers? And what would be the fruit of that? That's what we're just going to try to compare, okay? So here's our first question. Is any exchange between two people in the absence of direct physical compulsion by one party against the other, or the threat of violence or whatever, or harm, necessarily free? So this is her first primary question. And there's a lot of nuance in that. You'll see why she does it this way. But the summary she gives, she says this Nozikian atheist worldview, persons are self-owning individuals and therefore exchanges without a direct threat are free. So he believes there is a possibility of free exchange. Any 2 consenting adults can give that free exchange idea, right? That's that idea that Richard mentioned earlier. The Rawlsian and Srinivasian, I'm going to collapse those together because she, in her article, takes ostensibly his side. How rightly and fairly, again, she does it doesn't really matter for this. I'm just going to present them as one view. So based on that sort of atheist worldview, persons are embedded into systems where nonviolent exploitation is real, and so exchanges is compelled by an external presence or threat. So in other words, she's saying there is no such thing as consent within these systems because they all have some form of compulsion, or they're all going to compel people in some way, unfairly or unjustly. So, Richard, that's sort of her two views that she presents there, which, based on earlier, I'm assuming you think there's some third options. That's a false dilemma she's creating there. But what are your thoughts about what she's presenting? Where do you think, given your atheist worldview, where do you land on answering that question?
One thing I want to start off with for all of these four questions, we're going to talk about the atheist view versus the Christian worldview. But I want the audience to consider for a moment that there's a God who says, hey, I love all of you guys, and I want you all to be fair. I want you to treat each other as if you have value. I care for all of you, and I want you to behave, and I want you to consider each other, and I want you to work hard. So there's that kind of God. And then there's another kind of God that says, actually, there's very specific things that you need to do. And if you don't do them, then you're in trouble and I don't really care about you. In which case, if you're part of this group, you guys can just pretty much enjoy life as long as you follow my rules. Treat everybody else as resources. Everybody else is kind of a resource for you, or dirt. If you say you want to get rid of them, get rid of them. If you need them for resources, go ahead. It's all about you. All this stuff is for you. So there's that kind of God. I'm going to answer this question as if there's not a God, and what we do is just what we decide to do. So if someone says, well, God wants me to do this, I don't think about whether there's really a God. I think about what are you going to do? And you can tell me that God wants you to do that or not. But I'm mostly going to focus on your behavior and what's your mindset. So my answer to this is that it's true that two people who are about to make an exchange, one person can exploit the other. And that's a good point. Like a very wealthy person could walk up to a very poor person who's desperate and say, okay, yeah, I'll give you these very basic things just to keep you out of dying or out of even worse situations. But in return, you have to give me a lot more than you normally would under usual circumstances. But you got to do it. I agree, that's exploitive. But then another problem with this is that what if there's a government who says no two people can make any exchange unless we're watching over them and we check off all these boxes? If you do that, you're going to have another situation, which is that government is going to become exploitive. So just like she's worried about the rich person exploiting the poor person, she should also be worried about a government that's exploiting both of those people, because the rich person in that first scenario is just thinking about himself. And then that government in the other situation is at some point going to think about themselves unless you have very strict oversight. So I always push for some sort of oversight, both at the local level and at the national level. My worldview isn't atheism. It's be like Charles Ingalls as much as possible and try to live in a city or a town like Walnut Grove, or a community as close to Walnut Grove as possible. And Christians like to say, those are Christian icons, right? And I'm like, okay, great. But the behavior that they're all paying attention to each other. If some people are cheating, then the whole town gets together and says, hey, that's not right. I think that's the way to go. And neither this idea of, hey, as long as we're consenting, it's fine, or the state's going to take care of it, neither of those fit into that Walnut Grove mentality. I think that the community needs to get together and decide now, hey, that can be terrible too. Nazis and ISIS are communities too. So I think there have to be standards about how you think of each other. Leroy can argue that that's where God comes in, the Christian God, in which case, great. But again, I'm thinking Walnut Grove, not just your community decides, but a community very similar to Walnut Grove, and the dads acting very similarly to Charles Ingalls. So I do have my preferences on what that community and what those dads should be doing. It's not like I'm saying everybody just do whatever you want. But yeah, so just to wrap up, I think that when two people make an interaction, they should both be concerned about their surrounding community, so that I can't just walk around up and down my street and just try to come up with ideas on my own. I should be thinking about my community, and that community should be a lot more like Walnut than say a Nazi community or an ISIS community. I don't like this idea that there's favored people and then all these other people are either resources or dirt. I don't like that either. So, that's kind of an overview of what I said.
So, in answer to that question, is it possible to have this free exchange in the absence of the threat of violence? I think we would agree in that, Richard. I think it is possible. But that doesn't necessarily mean, as Srinivasian seems to imply, that means consent determines moral rightness. Just because there's consent doesn't mean that makes it a morally just, because and this is where I think her system is similar to yours, because you don't make a distinction between morality and meaning and purpose and political systems. Those are all one thing. And so she's not making that distinction either. Morality is the system is morality, consent is morality. All those things, in some way, they're all there's no clear distinction in those categories, I think. But for the Christian, we would say, yeah, there's some distinctions in those categories of things. So it is possible, even in an unjust system, people can have freedom to make choices, although, there are influences that matter, but there's still personal identity and individual autonomy to some degree in every system. Even in a pure Marxist system, I would argue there's still some degrees of freedom because I as a human being, exist. So I think she is creating a sort of false dichotomy, and you're right in that, Richard. And we do share some of that view, which I kind of figured we would have that. So let's move to the second question. Is any free, not physically compelled, that's what she means by free, is any not physically compelled exchanged morally permissible? That's sort of, we already addressed this a little bit in the previous point, but she has it as a separate question. So again, she says the Nozikian atheist worldview, basically personal rights and personal property are fundamental and therefore all free choices are morally good. That's how she frames that view. So yes, I have the right to personal autonomy. Yes, I have the right to property. Therefore, any decision is morally good. Okay. So she says, well, counter to that, her Rawlsian, Srinivasian combined atheist worldview, she says the collective good overrides both the personal and property rights. Therefore, consent cannot determine the moral good. Now, this is very interesting. In her article, she says this: does anyone have the right to sex? This is an article she wrote. Now, this is an interesting thing. I want to get to this because, again, she's a feminist, she's a feminist thinker, ethicist, philosopher. And so she doesn't see the idea of how we explore sexuality, say like prostitution or other things like that. Those all have economic implications. Those all have social, moral implications. So she doesn't seem to, in my view, have a guardrail between this. So I came across this. This is outside of the article we're exploring here. I found this article related to her book that she published. Does anyone have the right to sex? Srinivasian says everyone is entitled to what they like and what they want, except when it excludes a certain group. So then the state must intervene. Now, this is an interesting thing. And so you can have what you like, except if anybody's excluded from that. Okay. So, and we'll get to the sexual ethic of that, which again, for her is connected to the economics of justice. So Richard, atheist worldview, in past shows, you made it clear that morality, meaning, as I said a minute ago, are really the same, which assumes, I assume kind of connects to is there a separate category for public policy, or is that morality, meaning, are all those in that same song? Does that all that blend together in one category? What's your take on that?
Yeah, let me address that first, because people might have missed our previous shows. I do say that morality and meaning are the same thing, but what I mean is the way you perceive morality. And I've said in our previous shows that morality is everything. It's what drives you. It's what gives you purpose. And there's a clear distinction between what you think are the opinions and preferences and what you think of as morality. So if someone has a different opinion or preference, you're like, okay, cool, that's interesting. But if they have a different moral stance, then you get really angry. And that's how you know the difference. So when people say, why do I get mad about this and not that? It's because the thing that you get riled up about is your morality. And I say that's exactly the same as your meaning. Now, I would advise people to make that meaning and that morality, especially if they embrace it with a community of people who are like-minded. I would say make a system, make a political system along those lines. That being said, if that community decides to make something like Nazis or ISIS, then I'm going to have a problem with that. And you can say, well, so what? But I'm going to say, well, I'm still going to, in my worldview, life is a battle of these moral systems. You have your people like your Walnut Groves, your people like your ISISes, and your people like your Nazis. That's the world we live in. And if you like the Walnut Grove like me, you might have to be in that battle. You might have to join me in that battle. And then you can say, well, God wants us to. Great. But my take is, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be in that battle. So I don't say they're all the same or that they're all okay. I think my Walnut Grove is the way to go, and I'm going to be in that battle to keep that Walnut Grove alive. As for this particular question, I smirked a little bit when you quoted this author as saying that if you're going to, this thing with sex is okay as long as there isn't an excluded group. And then if there is an excluded group, the state should intervene. I think of this right-wing group. There's a right-wing group of men who feel like they've been jilted by women and that they're
the incels, right?
And,
yeah.
Right. And I'm thinking in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of situations where people on two completely opposite streams are suddenly high-fiving each other because they agree on something. I can imagine these right-wing Andrew Tate loving worshipers who normally hate the left hearing a foreigner say, well, a foreigner sounding name, they would say, telling them that they're entitled and that the state would help them. And they're like, well, hold on, maybe we'll go over here. So it's very interesting how our political systems have kind of gone all over the place. And now they're attracting the most extreme from the other side now with all these, with all this wishy-washiness that we're seeing. But to answer your question, I wouldn't say it was morally good from my perception. And remember, I'm saying that our morality comes from us perceiving it and then acting on it. And you could say, well, who are you compared to a Nazi or an ISIS guy? I'm going to say, well, I'm Richard, and I'm going to be in this battle. And I think life is a battle of these moral systems. So I'm in that battle. And you can say, well, you don't have any objective standard by which to put yourself over them. And I'll say, no, but I'm going to try to persuade people to agree with me. And we're going to try to outmaneuver these ISIS and these Nazis guys, even though there's not a higher standard to stop us.
Yeah. And so I think, you've pinpointed the objections that I, of course, would bring up. And that's, you're well aware of those limitations, I think, of what I would consider the persuasiveness of your argument, or to make your argument normative. I think that there lacks some grounding there. But in the end,
right,
there is some agreement in how we see the failures of her view. So let me jump to question 3. I want to come back to that sexual ethic thing because I want to explore the idea of guardrails and where that is. And so let me jump to question 3 here and see if we can't deal with this one. Because I want to get through all of our 4 questions and then kind of summarize all these things in our approach to economic justice. So here's our 3rd question. Do people deserve all they're able and only what they're able to get through free exchange? Now, this is an interesting question. So if you can get it, does that mean you have a moral right to possess it? As long as it goes through, quote unquote, a free exchange, which is sort of a loaded question because she assumes that there is no such thing as free exchange. So she's kind of embedded in the question, the premise of that question, she's going to clearly say no. But she says this Nozikian answer from that atheist worldview: a personal liberty is the highest good. Therefore, anything acquired through free exchange is morally just. And of course, you can see where this is going to go in terms of Elon Musk is a trillionaire. If he can get it through a free exchange, he provides a service, then that's morally good. Because again, she makes no distinction between the moral system and the economic system. So she's going to say if there's inequality, it doesn't matter how much you obtain by consent. If there's somebody else without, that's going to make it an injustice. So fairness and equality, she says, are the highest good. And moral obligations exist outside the social contract, and the value of the person is tied to economic systems. Now, here is where I'm going to probably be a little bit, from a Christian worldview, a little bit closer to her assessment of why that's wrong. But I actually have an answer that she's not addressing, and I'll get to that in a second. So first, let me come to you, Richard. Where do you rest with that question that she's trying to answer? Do people deserve all they're able to, and only what they're able to get through free exchange?
So yeah, and I have a problem with both of the possibilities that she offers, because it's true that a wealthy person is going to be able to acquire a lot more. If they go into a community with a bunch of middle class people, that wealthy person could potentially come away with all of those houses. They could end up owning that entire community and then kick everybody out. And he would say, "Well, I went through and personally negotiated with them, and they gave their consent, so I can do it." That can be a problem, and the people might not realize the situation. The community might not realize that they're being kind of taken over by this wealthy person they're giving consent, but they're also not wise enough to see the problem. And I can see why it would be tempting to have a different authority come in and say, "Hey, this isn't right." At the same time, if the city council and the mayor or the governor is in charge of all these things, they could also become corrupt. And then it could be that the city council and the mayor are also messing with these interactions, so that it's also not going well. The city council and the mayor are doing great. They're all living high on life, and sometimes they're not even in the city anymore because they have luxury, condos, and tropical paradise. So yeah, for me, the concern is corruption in each of those cases. And I don't really care whether there's a God or not. I care whether this community has these standards where they're thinking about the well-being of each other, and they're thinking about what the goal is of either this wealthy person coming in to conduct transactions with them. Like I would think all the community should get together and have a town meeting and say, how are we going to deal with this guy? He definitely wants to take over our town. He is going to deal with us as we see fairly as he comes into our house, but we should be aware of what his big goal is. And at the same time, also, if a mayor or a town council was also corrupt, I think the town should get together and say, "Hey, we got to replace these guys because they've become corrupt." So in each case, I'm seeing the community as having the better interest because they're looking out for each other, but not community in terms of like communism, because you could have a corrupt community leaders as well. So I really push that there's individual responsibility, that you're taking care of your family, you're thinking of the other family as having as much value as yours. And then a community of people like that are probably better equipped to stop this corrupt oppressor or this corrupt state. Is probably the best answer. Whether God exists or not, I'm much more concerned with how people handle themselves and how their community handles itself.
Yeah. Leroy, I think I hear you okay now, so hopefully you can hear us. Any thoughts on this third question?
How utopian? Sorry. Who? How utopian? Not, and I'm not talking about you, Richard. I'm just talking about the view. How utopian? There's only been one utopia that's ever existed on the planet, and for a very short period of time. And any other view or attempt at utopia is going to destroy people, because people are free moral agents. They get to choose what kind of existence they want to live. And what seems to be suggested is, I should say, is that we get to take agency away from people because their agency harms them, because their choices harms them. Well, you're asking to live in a different world, aren't you? You're asked to live in a world where nothing ever harms anyone, and we don't live in that world. As a matter of fact, we live in a world where harm is everywhere, and the potential for harm is everywhere, because people are free moral agents that get to make decisions about the way the world actually works, according to the way the world actually works. And what's being suggested here is a view that doesn't fit the way the world actually is. That doesn't mean that, I suppose the argument could come that we should try to change the world, but you can't change the world. You can change how people think, either through force or through appealing to them in some way. But the world always pushes back. Reality always pushes back. No matter how much I believe that car driving 70 miles an hour down the road, well, if I walk in front of it, it won't hit me. It will hit me. And I think what's being suggested here is that we try to live in a world that is not real, and that people's decisions don't matter. Jesus said the blind lead the blind and they both fall into the ditch. And what this view is trying to get us to believe is that there is no ditch and that nobody's blind. And it's fascinating. And I think it has caused more death and destruction in the world than any other idea known to man. This is the same idea that Pol Pot, that Mao, that Stalin, all of these guys used because they knew better than everyone else and they needed to force everyone else to those views. It's madness. That's what I think.
Yeah. So here's where this third question is interesting to me, because it starts to bring into focus, I think, what's really happening here. We're all forced to put something as the center of what's that thing, what's that force or influence that's going to bring justice into the society. So for a Srinivasian, she is going to say it's the state. The state, think if you have a circle and then surrounded by all these other little circles outside of it. And that center circle is going to organize all of these other ideas, whether it be the personal liberties, businesses, private associations like guilds or unions, schools, education, business. She's saying, look, the only way to bring justice is if it's all run through the state at the center. The state is going to be the thing that determines what is fair for all people. Therefore, the individual can't have rights. So it's not about what you agree to. It's not even about only what you're capable of earning. The state's going to determine what you should have, because they sit at the center. So in contrast to that, you'd have, say, the Christian nationalists, for example. So you'd have Christian nationalists who are going to put the church at the center, the actual physical. This is like very similar to, say, what the Middle Ages and the Pope would have been, the papacy, where the church and the state are meshed into one entity. And then therefore the Pope sort of is the rule. He's above all these things. He's sort of directing the king, and he's sort of directing this with a Christian moral system. And so you get this sort of Christian nationalism, middle-aged version of it. There's different kinds of Christian nationalism. I know that, but I'm just saying that there's that version of it where it puts the church and therefore some leader like the Pope at the center, and then he's orchestrating the state and the private organizations and all these other sort of things. The Christian worldview, I think the best, that's most compatible with the biblical and what it the Bible, what it teaches, it would say that at the center is actually the person of Christ. But it's not a compelled version through state agency or whatever. It's saying when you have your private guilds and your educational institutions, we have two individuals making exchanges, and you have the state over, it's a circle outside like any other. When you have a commitment to Christ to guide you, this is, I think, what the framers argued, a society that, like ours, a constitutional republic, as long as it remains committed to some moral standard, and those individuals guided by Christ direct the laws of the state, then there's a moral system at play. So you can have, it still doesn't mean it's perfect, because people are sinful, they have autonomy, they have independence, and they're still going to make poor decisions or selfish decisions or wrong decisions. Therefore, there's always going to be some sort of economic injustice. I think, Richard, what you end up having is, because there's no Christ there and you don't want the state there, you're putting the Ingalls society, the sort of Walnut Grove ideal at the center. That ethic is, you're going to say, is determinate. But I think Leroy's kind of point is that ideal ethic, that the Walnut Grove ethic, is a fiction. So you believe that if we have a shared fiction, that can bring justice everywhere. So the Christians say Christ isn't a fiction. You, as an atheist, say, well, Christ is the Christian fiction. So you say that's our fiction. So you're just picking a different fictional story to stand at the center. We're saying that there's substantially, ontologically, by nature, a distinction there. So I see why we end up, I think, agreeing on all of these things, because you think I've just picked a Christian fiction, you're picking a television fiction. But if our fictions align, then we should have alignment and agreement. So we're not going to solve today whether Christianity is a fiction and Walnut Grove is not. But I'm just saying, I think that makes sense of why when we dialogue about this, you and I and Leroy generally, in the structural side of it, what sits at the center, we're putting something different, but morally and ethically, it sounds very similar on the way it plays out. I don't know. Is that a fair summary of how we're each unpacking these questions? Do you think that gets to the heart of these distinctions we're making?
For me, and this is before the fourth question, right?
Yeah, we'll still do the fourth question yet.
Okay, yeah. For me, I'm imagining that the three of us in our families probably live our lives pretty much exactly the same way. And that I think if we were trying to rebuild our nation, we would probably still have our communities pretty much the exact same way. Now, I would want my family living the kind of life that you guys probably have your families living in, and they do. We've got a young daughter in high school and another daughter going to University of Arizona starting this year. So, we're probably the classic of, American family. So we would probably do that. You could say, well, hey, Christ is this ontological, truly existing source by which we do this. And I say, well, it makes the most sense. And it's my moral meaning and my morality. And then you can say, well, some other guy has a different one. And I would say, well, I'm in battle with him. It's a fight for existence. But aliens watching us would say Joe and Leroy and Richard live pretty much identical lives in terms of their moral. They just attribute it to different things. It's going to come down to how we live. And then you can tell yourself, it could be, I'm not saying that Christ doesn't exist. I just say that when people keep making him different things and they act on that, at least creates confusion, and that confusion could affect your behavior. And I don't want, I hate to see Christians change from a Joe Miller type of life to an Andrew Tate kind of life. And they do that under the Christian banner. They say, hey, I'm a Christian. They join Twitter. 5 years later, I'm still a Christian, but he's much more Andrew Tate than he is Joe Miller. And I don't like to see that. And it's because he doesn't know himself. He's attributed this to Christ, but then Christ went from here to here, and now he's here because he doesn't know himself. And in each case, I want people to be more like Joe Miller, however that works.
Yeah. Well, me too. I want everyone to be just like me. But I do think, I think you're right in your assessment. It is possible to build a healthy society without everybody agreeing that Christ is at the center of that. I think that's actually the constitutional republic that was framed. The framers were not all Christians as I would define it. I would define many as deists, but they had a shared Christian ethic. They had that Walnut Grove sort of morality. And they said that sits at the center of this. And then they embody that within the Constitution, making certain assumptions about that. And they say, if we have this Constitution to guide us, we can function societally as a society in a healthy way. So I would not argue that it's not impossible to do that in a pluralistic society. I think the broader issue is that to do that, we've got to recognize that there are distinctions between moral systems and economic systems. And that's not what Srinivasian or others are allowed. They're balling it all into one. And I think all of us agree that that's an unhealthy thing, even if our rationale for that is different. Leroy, any thoughts from you on this?
Yeah, why start it in the 20th century in an industrial, almost post-industrial society where there's a system already built where people flourish, right? Where the most people can flourish. Why start there? Why not start back where the Incans were, in Incan society, where the king, Atahualpa, was the god that they worshipped, and all of Incan society flourished around them. They had festivals, they had sacrifices. sacrificed hundreds of thousands of people to their gods. Why not? Why start here? Why start the story here? Why not start the story elsewhere in history and then see how that all cashes out or see how that all works out? Where the god king was the center of Incan worship until Pizarro came and killed him. And when Pizarro killed him, the whole Incan society um, fell apart. Why?
Collapse.
Because their meaning structure, the place where they got meaning from, wasn't really real. Reality pushed back. Their king wasn't a god. He was just a man. And Pizarro showed them that he was a man. My point being is every society has a meaning system, and that meaning system either accords with reality or it doesn't. And when you start the society in a, in the 20th century where we are, where we have flourishing systems and the most people are successful, yeah, it all seems to make sense. But if you started at a different place in history and you start trying to put your utopias out, then it doesn't cash out to what we have right now. What we have right now is hard won, hard fought through laws, through battles, through a lot of death and destruction, unfortunately. And what we have is the system that seems to work. And that system didn't start arbitrarily. It didn't start because a bunch of guys got together and said we wanted our own Walnut Grove, right? Walnut Grove is what the system produced. The system produced Walnut Grove. Walnut Grove didn't produce the system, is my point. And as I'm saying, with this argument is that the argument starts with a particular framework in mind that assumes a lot of things without ever having to prove anything. Because if you actually looked at the way history works, history is ugly, it's bloody, it's brutal, it is all filled with a lot of death. And these ideas work in a post-industrial society. They really can be fleshed out and people can sit around at their coffee tables and talk about how great things are, but they can never produce them from their own ideas. They can never produce them from the beginning. And I think that's what the real issue is here. We talk about justice. What is the basis of justice? Human flourishing is the basis of justice. Why? You're starting out with the Christian worldview, the Christian ideals, the Christian perspective in the very beginning. Start with the atheistic one, where nobody is, where everybody gets to choose and everybody, whoever has the most might wins out. Why not start there? Because that one doesn't work. It never has worked. It hasn't produced anything. It hasn't produced the society that we have right now. So the whole concept of human flourishing is madness. It's not a basis for building a society. We hope that we build a society where humans flourish, of course. But if we start with human flourishing in the beginning, you're going to get quite a bit different society because everybody has a different concept of what we mean by flourishing. My different concept of flourishing is not atheistic at the very center. But what about those people whose concepts of human flourishing regard atheism? I mean, I'm just saying this all works in theory, but in the real world, reality pushes back.
Yeah, I think that we're bringing at least some clarity to these questions of where we stand, why we stand there, and how they work out. Let me jump to the fourth question, though, because I think each of these questions helps us a little bit more pull our ideas together. So, Srinivasian's fourth question. Here's my summary of it. I think it's kind of worded as a double negative. It's a little confusing. So my summary is this. Her question is all externally reinforced moral duty a moral injustice? Now, her sort of summary of the Nozikian atheist worldview is that the individual he says that the individual sits at the center of the social contract. That's our agreed upon relationships. That would be, the social contract would be sort of the Walnut Grove society in the sense that we all agree to live in a certain way together. So Richard's view, I would put under the social contract theory by and large. That's very much assumes an atheist worldview where we can just agree to agree. And if we have this social contract, therefore, if we live within that social contract, we have freedom to do and choose to whatever. So I think it fits broadly within that. But anyway, so he says that no duty can be imposed on the individual that violates the personal freedom or autonomy. Okay, that's what he's going to say. So you can't impose outside of that social contract because at the core of that is personal freedom and autonomy. Again, I think she creates, again, a false dichotomy here, saying, oh, well, that's false, which I think that is a false thing. But she says in her atheist worldview that the state is at the center, and this is the point I brought up in the last point. The state is at the center of this social contract. So we do have a social contract. She still has social contract theory there, but she says the state essentially is there to reinforce or add addendums or add pieces to that contract. Therefore, justice and moral duty to the collective must be imposed, even if it violates personal freedom. So she said that's fine to violate your personal freedom or your sense of autonomy because the collective good overrides the individual good. That's going to be her take on that. So she's put, again, that state at the center, and as opposed to the community at the center of the social contract, she's going to put the state at the center of that social contract, and therefore you can violate personal rights. So Richard, what's your take on where do you fit in that spectrum of ideas with your thinking?
Okay, the first thing I would say is that we all live in social contracts. We're humans and we have to live in a community to survive. You can be by yourself and survive for a while, but if you're going to, if there's going to be more humans, those humans have to live together in a community within a social contract. I mean, Christians, would sing hallelujah to that because they live in a social contract. They just say it's Jesus' contract. So social contracts is what I call the song. That's that meaning system that everyone's embracing. So I agree with that. But then I remember my second point is that it's a battle of meaning systems, and the meaning systems that fade away, people no longer talk about. You can have an objectively true meaning system, but if 8 billion people don't talk about it, then it doesn't do anything. It doesn't do any work. So this lady that we've been studying today, I agree with her that she sees the threat in a powerful person being corrupt and taking advantage of a poor person. I agree with her on all of that. What she does wrong is that she assumes there's this utopian state that comes in and makes everything right. And it keeps this wealthy person from oppressing the poor person. And, Leroy just made a statement. If someone were to ask me for my worldview, well, Leroy's final thing that he just said for that third question, and they say, how do you see things? I would play almost everything that Leroy just said and say this, what he just said is what I think. Because he started off with this guide who said, hey, you people, you're what matters. Everybody else is a resource or they're dirt. So you can treat them as a resource or dirt. And you're right. He was right that society flourished for a while at the expense of all these other people, which a Walnut Grove community and Charles Ingalls would be completely devastated by. So, as he was saying that this whole time, I was like to myself, I was going to preach the good word, go sing it, because I absolutely agree that that's not the way to go. You can't treat each other as if you're special and everyone else is either a resource or dirt. You have to think of other people as you're doing it. So I do think there's a social contract, and so I don't think that you can just do whatever you want. I want to just bring up a couple of books. Like you guys, I was raised in the Bible, but I was also raised on Atlas Shrugged and Conflict of Vision. And Atlas Shrugged, this idea is that everyone should be treated according to their need rather than what they can produce. So all these companies change the rules, and they're like, if you work hard, that's great, but we're now going to pay people more if they need more. And so all these companies full of producers, people who produce things over the generations, they stopped producing. The workforce would argue over who needs more. And they would say, well, I need it, our kids' sake. And the other one would say, well, we just lost our, we just lost our apartment or whatever. So they argued over who needs more, and it collapsed. The whole industry has collapsed because people focused on what people needed instead of working hard. And remember the Walnut Grove, you're out there working, you could have been stabbed by somebody the night before, but you got to get out there. Your neighbors can come and help you. It's about production, and you got to work hard in order to still be alive. I'm all for that. So I think if you focus too much on need, you can collapse. Now, that being said, you should watch out for each other. And, like you guys say, a lot of Christian communities will. A lot of atheist humanist groups will say, hey, these people need something, we're going to go help them. Again, I don't think it's about whether God exists or not. I think it's about whether you work hard, take care of your family, and take care of your community. Be aware that these wealthy, powerful people can be oppressive without oversight, but also be aware that your governing force can also be corrupt without oversight. So you got to bring in oversight, and you got to have these constraints. And that's what Thomas Sowell argues in Conflict of Visions, that, and he wasn't Christian. He's not a Christian. He's one of the most conservative people who's ever lived. He's still alive now as of this taping. He was in his 90s. He said, you can't just do whatever you want. You got to have these constraints, and these constraints are what people embrace. And those constraints are your song. They're your social contract. So your social contract better be built for endurance, and you're battling against other social contracts.
Leroy, thoughts?
Yeah. What's the gal's name? Is it Srinivasian, or is that her name?
Srinivasian? I'm saying it wrong. Just
You know what's fascinating about her story, her perspective? We've seen it work out in history. It was called dekulakization. Dekulakization is what the Russians did in sending all the rich farmers to Siberia to die while simultaneously stealing all their farms and their food, so that all the people in Russia could flourish. And what that ultimately led to was millions upon millions of deaths for famine. It was called dekulakization. So we've seen it actually work in history. And under her view, because it was because of the government, it was not bad. It was not evil, right? It's just because the government did it. And even as much as I love Thomas Sowell is what you call a realist, right? He looks at what is and then begins to extrapolate reality from what is, but he can't give you a framework for existence. He can only tell you what works, right? Or what has worked economically, but he can't give you a framework for saying why it's right. He can just simply say that the other things don't work. And if we remove any kind of ultimate authority from the question, again, you're asking for a different type of reality where you're going to now force humans to think in ways in which they don't think, to do things in which that they don't want to do, to act in ways in which they don't want to act. Really, what this is arguing for is some sort of um, authoritarian rule, right? Because it isn't really the people. I mean, it's under the guise that it's the people who are doing this. No, it's just a certain group of people, a certain selected group of people who get to tell everybody else what to do and how to live and what's right and what's wrong, instead of people appealing to something outside of themselves. Again, as we Christians would call it God, right? We would call it the Word of God, and having that be our standard, right? And if that standard, I mean, the crazy thing is, you're free to reject that standard, but there are consequences for rejecting that standard. That's what we would say.
Yeah, so I think my issue of pushback, I guess, or the area I wanted to push back a little bit on that, Richard, is the idea that we all have embraced social contract. It's just that's not true, at least not historically. And I do think I've seen churches. It bothered me years ago. I've seen a lot of hiring agencies. I started to see this about 15 years ago with mega churches when they were at their prime, and you'd have these. I actually sort of wrote some articles about this. They were encouraging pastoral staff, the staff of the church, to create their own social contract. And I tried to push back on it years ago, but I don't have the money, and those people were wealthy, and so they're like, "Who are you? You don't care." But there is something in our cultural air that assumes that contract theory stands at the core. Matter of fact, racial contract theory, which Leroy and I have done quite a bit of work over the years in that area of critical theory, critical justice, critical social studies, all of that assumes a contract theory basis, which is rooted in Enlightenment philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and Jean Rousseau. So, but here's the idea. G.K. Chesterton, English, I guess, social commentator, I guess we'd call him today. But he's in his book, Orthodoxy, he exposed what I think is this flaw in this philosophy that we all operate through this social contract. He wrote that morality didn't begin as a cold agreement, quote, "I will not hit you if you don't hit me," which is the sort of the Walnut Grove thing. He's saying that's not how it started, which is kind of what Leroy's point is here. He said but it was in reverence for something holy, something transcendent outside of us, outside of the society. people learn virtue not by contract, but by worship. This is his whole take. He says this, quote, they gained their morality by guarding their religion. They did not cultivate courage. They fought for the shrine and they found that they had become courageous. They did not cultivate cleanliness. They purified themselves for the altar and found the way to be clean. So his argument is that contract theory, social contract theory, undermines, because it is the Christian worldview, it has several fundamental assumptions, worldview assumptions. First and foremost, it assumes that our only motivation is selfishness. And we have to mitigate that selfish motivation. But the Christian worldview assumes that, yes, we're sinful and broken, but we're also image bearers, and our motivation could be something else. So not everything operates, although by and large our society has adopted that social contract theory. I would argue that the alternative to there's an atheist assumption within contract theory that is fundamentally rejected within Christianity. And I would push towards that kind of a solution in that, and to resolve these sort of questions and problems, because they don't run into the challenges that, say, especially the Srinivasian atheism leads to. And to push back on the contract there, I want to do our follow-up now to the issue of sex and how that relates, because I'm really curious about your take, because you brought that up earlier, but I don't want to go too fast the social contract thing. If you have a thought on that.
Yeah, I want to bring something up. So let's say that I have a community and Leroy has a community, and the community that operates under me, we don't believe in Jesus, but we do pretty much the same things. And then you have Leroy's community that does believe in Jesus. So in these communities, all the men go to work. And I don't mean to be like for people who are against equality, but to keep it simple, all the men go to work every day. The women stay home, teach the kids, kids maybe go to school. But while in both of those communities, while we're doing that, bullies go to each house and start taking what they want and start harming the women. They go to the school, and all the men are working in both communities. So in each community, we gather those bullies and we bring them together. And we say, hey, you can't do this. This is wrong. And we all three get rid of those three bullies. We arrest them, or whatever. You tell your own story. This is just a hypothetical example. But we stop the behavior in each case just mightily as the other one. Now, my thing is, Leroy's community will say, well, we did this because of Jesus. And I'll say, well, we did this because we had to stop it. Now, if those guys in Leroy's community didn't stop the behavior, who's going to stop them? They violated Jesus's code. It's not a social contract. It's Jesus's mandates, and they violated it. Who's going to stop them? It's the men. It's the men in his community that are going to stop them. My point is, I don't care whether it's a social community or Jesus's mandates. If those men don't stop what they're doing and go get those bullies and stop the behavior, those bullies are going to keep going whatever they want to do. Tell yourself whatever you want to say. Hey, this is Jesus' mandates. Hey, this is a social contract. We're doing the same thing. But even people who live under Jesus' mandates are in a contract with Jesus. It's not that the social contract has to just be with society. You can have it with Jesus, but you better agree on what Jesus wants. So that's my pushback on whether we're all social contract. We're all social contract, and just your contract could be with Jesus. And then the second point is, you are accountable to somebody. It's us. We're the ones who hold each other accountable. And if we don't hold each other accountable, other people are going to do whatever they want.
Okay. Leroy, any thoughts on that? Uh-oh, we lost him again.
The audio. See, if there is a devil, he's on my side today.
Yeah.
Because he's stopping Leroy's audio.
This is proof that there is a devil there. So I will jump in for Leroy here since we lost him again. But I guess my only pushback until we get Leroy back is that what I would suggest is that what falls apart in that framing that you provided is that there lacks something that transcends the community itself. There's nothing outside of, there's no objective standard outside of that would tell us that the redefinition of what is good for the community is right or wrong. And that lack of durability means that there's going to be a shift over time in how those thoughts are evaluated.
I agree.
Who gets to evaluate?
I completely agree.
I think
but that can also happen to you guys too.
Well,
what you just said, a shift
in
over time,
practice, it
happens to
happens.
atheist
Yeah.
communities and to Christian communities.
Yeah, absolutely. But the question is, why does it happen? Does it happen in violation of those external standards, or does it happen because it has no external standard? The Christian would argue that yes, all those communities shift, but because they redefine those standards in some collectivist way. So in other words, the collective agreement doesn't determine, for the Christian, the collective agreement doesn't determine moral good. Justice isn't set by the social standard, and you can't redefine, the words are not in a postmodern sense up for grabs in terms of meaning, that we would say that there's a realist interpretation of meaning for language itself. But outside of that transcendent standard, and say, for example, the U.S. Constitution, that is a transcendent standard. It's not necessarily God, but it is a transcendent standard. That's why you get the conflict in the Supreme Court. Is it a living, breathing document? Or are you a constitutionalist that says, oh no, well, what did they have in mind? There's meaning embedded in those words. And the worldview, the collectivist worldview, that social contract worldview says, well, the contract has changed. The society has changed. Therefore, we have to change the meaning of those words to fit our new society. Or if it's a racial social contract, it's the oppressed group. The oppressed group gets to decide what those words mean. They get to decide what justice is. So all of that sort of Walnut Grove at the center of the social contract has no governing principle. At least there isn't one that gives durability to that over time. And this is where I think the challenge of...
Would you agree, though?
Go ahead.
Would you agree, though, that in your community and my community, it's going to come down to what we do? Our behavior is going to determine enforcement.
Well, yeah, I mean, behavior is obviously going to set this. If there's an objective standard, don't steal, thou shalt not steal, and you steal, it violates that standard. But the question is,
and if nobody enforces
qualifies
it,
as stealing?
If nobody enforces it, so these bullies are going to our houses and stealing from us and harming our women, and we don't endorse it, and we don't enforce it. We don't say, well, we're not going to stop them, but Jesus is going to stop them. He's not. We're going to stop them.
Well, whoever said that no one's going to stop them except Jesus is going to stop them? I don't say whose worldview is arguing that.
I just
is there?
Well,
is there
I'm not saying
argument?
that you. I'm not saying that anyone's saying that. I'm saying that we're doing it because of Jesus. Great, that's wonderful. You can do it because of Jesus, but if you don't do it, it's not going to get done, and the bullies are going to keep doing whatever they're doing. It's like I've been arguing before.
We'd agree with that.
This objective standard isn't going to do any work. The enforcement is going to come from us. You can say the standard did the work of making us aware of it, but the standard isn't going to come down and stop the bullies. We have to stop the bullies.
Well, yeah, I mean, we don't have disagreement there that there is a social influence, there's a societal influence, there's also a state influence. The police can do some of that. In a medieval context, it would be the clergy would have some sort of enforcement duties to go and find the witches or whatever it was and reinforce that. No one's saying that, well, maybe except for the pure pacifist who is going to say, we should never do that. But that's possible, and they've reaped the whirlwind and those sort of ideas where we're just trying to totally separate ourselves outside of consent because no force is possible. So, yeah, no one's taking the thing. The question is not whether should we enforce it or not. That's moving the goalpost of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that what defines what is right and wrong needs something that transcends the collective agreement that will tell us, no, you've gone far afield of that. So when the U.S. Constitution, let's take that as just our shared standard, because you and I share that standard. When the Constitution says right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness kind of things, and thou shalt not infringe on, everyone has thou shalt not infringe on free speech, right? We have these rights to free speech that the government can't say, well, you can't speak against the president. And you have a right to tell the president, go pound sand. We would say that that's an external thing. Now, if you look at surveys of 30% of those under 25, or I think it might be higher, maybe you can correct that, of college students under 25 say, we need limits on free speech because that hurts people's feelings or that does harm. Speech is a form of violence. Silence is violence. So they're redefining violence, they're redefining speech to be action. Therefore, actions have to be restricted for the social contract good. Well, what's the constraint on that? if the society agrees that should be redefined, then you can choose to push back. But the only reason you're choosing to is because it fits with your former social contract agreement. But that has no durability. There's no appeal to anything outside of it's a social preference that's now doomed social preference. That's what we're saying. The distinction is not that we shouldn't act. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, here's the thing. I don't mean to move the goalpost and to say that you're accusing, like I'm accusing you of saying we shouldn't do the behavior. Yeah. I'm not trying to move the goalpost. I'm saying that durability comes down to our enforcement alone, 100%. Now, our enforcement could be bolstered by this foundational source who tells us what to do, maybe. But it's our enforcement that keeps it durable. We're in a battle of songs, and the song that stays afloat is going to come down to our enforcement.
Yeah, no, and I think that's clear that but there is a substantial disagreement in what we say creates durability. That's what people need to take away from this. That without God at the center, there is going to be an argument that we need to keep something durable, but that durability is going to come through enforcement, whether it be through the state or some social action or something like that. And that's exactly what Srinivasan is arguing, is that the state needs to enforce this thing and the individual rights or property rights need to be weighed by the state. Here's where she runs into a problem. And I want to get your thing, how you see the boundary here, because here's where she works herself into a corner. So I mentioned this article earlier. Does anyone have the right to sex? That's the title of her article. So remembering she's a feminist social philosopher. So Srinivasan argues that agreement does not determine morality. Okay, so it's not whether you and I agree. We've already explored that. She tells the story of a guy named Elliot Rogers, a 22-year-old, back in 2014. He was a college dropout, became the world's most famous incel, involuntary celibate. A guy who can't even, convince a woman to be with him romantically because he's so out there from the social norm. That's the definition of incel, involuntarily celibate. So, but he couldn't get all these girls that he found attractive to have sex with him. So the incels, and you brought this up earlier, the incel group sort of argued women and feminists were in the end responsible for what happened. So he went out and shot a bunch of people. He killed 4 or 5 people that he blamed for his involuntary celibacy. And his advocates argued that, well, it's the fault of feminists and the women. Had one of those wicked women just agreed to have sex with Elliot Rogers, he wouldn't have had to kill anyone. So if somebody would have just said, okay, I'll be the lamb to the slaughter, I'll be your little bed buddy there, and that would have been the problem. So now keep in mind, Srinivasan. Yeah, exactly. So now if Srinivasan, keep in mind her argument is that there's no right to property or autonomy from the collective if others are in need. So that's her argument. And she deals with this in her article. So this example gets used. If I have 10 sandwiches and the state then has a moral obligation to take my excess sandwiches and give them to the person who has none. Now, the Christian was going to say this. That is called privilege in the social contract or especially the critical theory side. I'm privileged with 10 sandwiches. The Bible would say I'm blessed with 10 and I have a moral obligation outside of the state to share because I've been blessed to be a blessing. That's what the Christian worldview is going to say. She doesn't, again, acknowledge that as a distinct idea, but she has to work within her worldview system. So she quotes this utopian socialist Charles Fourier, who proposed, quote, a guaranteed sexual minimum akin to a guaranteed basic income. In other words, just like you're obligated to distribute the sandwiches, you're obligated to distribute the sexual satisfaction. So for every man and woman, regardless of age and infirmity, only with sexual deprivation eliminated, Fourier thought could romantic relationships be truly free. So therefore the social service would be provided by an anonymous nobility who, Fourier said, knew how to subordinate love to the dictates of honor. So we all have a moral duty to provide the sexual capital for other people. So if you're in the class of women who are desired, you have 10 sandwiches, you are required to share those sandwiches with everybody else. So this is where I think she runs into a challenge, because she's going to resist that, because the classic feminism would say, no, it's my body, my choice. But Srinivasian is in this sort of philosophical, cultural, economic morality all bold into one, where the state is going to redistribute that wealth of what you have. So how do you make that distinction? Is it just purely that's with my Walnut Grove and morality? Is there a difference between sandwiches and sexuality? How do you know that difference exists? Because I don't think she makes a good argument against that. And she quotes some Marxist thinkers who say there shouldn't be a distinction between that. What if that group wins out? How do we figure that out? I mean, this is a serious question, by the way. I'm not trying to present a gotcha. I'm honestly
it's not a gotcha. It's not a gotcha.
Yeah.
This is
I'm
actually
just telling that for people. I don't think you will think it is, but people like think, oh, he's trying to trick Richard. I'm not putting him in her category. I just honestly want to know, how do we figure this out?
It's actually extremely easy. So, Little House on the Prairie lasted, I think, maybe 9-10 years. They just started a new one. They just started a new Little House on the Prairie. There's one season now on Netflix. And then there's the real Ingalls family, which I don't know much about. As much as I love the first season, not the first season, but the original show, Little House on the Prairie, that's Charles Ingalls, and that's Walnut Grove. And I'm sure historians would be like, oh, my poor child, you're so naive. It's fictional, but that's my ideal. That's my North Star. Imagine, so Charles Ingalls in the show had 4 daughters and a son, an adopted son. Imagine the mayor coming in saying, hey, it's Wednesday, 3 guys need sex. You got 4 daughters. So how do you want to handle this? Mr. Sampson, there's Mr. Phillips, and then there's, little Toby. He just became of age. So how do you want to work this out, Charles? How do you think Charles is going to work that out?
Oh, well, I mean, if you look at Walnut, that wouldn't even, I don't think that question would ever even come up, because that's so foreign to the worldview that's being presented there. I don't think it would. So
Exactly.
you'd be like, what do you, like high, if there was such a thing as drugs? I mean, there were drugs, but.
I think once Charles understood him, and I think it might take him an hour to understand him, but if Charles understood him, he would say, well, let's go talk about that out here in the field. Yeah. And then Charles would come back, and then they would be like, hey, what happened to that guy? And he'd be like, one guy.
Exactly.
Which is what I would do. I've got 2 daughters, and someone comes in and says, well, hey, there's this guy and there's this guy. We don't want him to hurt anybody, do we? And I'll say, no, we don't. Would you like to get hurt by continuing this conversation? And then my daughters too. My daughters would just slit the throat. If the state said, hey, you're going to have to be with this guy by state mandate, my daughters would slit their throat, not their own throat, but the guy's throat. And then, then maybe get arrested. I train my daughters to be warriors. So, my Walnut Grove is not whatever the town decides on. It's on the standards that the 1970s TV show Walnut Grove would decide. Their kids go to school. The women are going to get married to somebody. There's going to be the husband and wife raising their kids in their house. Somebody's going to go to work. I'm not so ancient that the wife can't be a school teacher, or she could be the town doctor. I'm really not antiquated in that sense, but there's going to be a stable adults raising their kids. The kids are going to go to school. They're going to go get a job. Nobody's going to go and hook up with somebody just because they're sad. They might hurt somebody otherwise. That's not my Walnut Grove standard. And you can say, okay, well, that's just your battle. But again, that's my worldview. This is a battle. And if my way of thinking evaporates, then it's gone. And so I don't want it to be gone. So I stay in the game and I keep up my battle, because I want my idea, which I see as higher than myself. I'm an atheist, but I think of this idea as more important, as more unassailable than anything else. And I want to dedicate myself to that idea. So you can say, well, that's a fairly religious concept. Okay. But that's my worldview. That's what I think the way things are.
Yeah. No, and that's a fair response. And again, I know you don't see that as a gotcha thing, but when I was reading Srinivasian's stuff, and then I came across this article and I was exploring about her, I realized from her atheist worldview, the way she balls it all together, she paints herself into a corner. And in my assessment, I think because you're doing a healthier sense of borrowing from the Christian worldview, we agree that that's happening, but for your own reasons, and we've outlined those. And I don't mean that as a knock against what you're saying now. I think it is a knock against it, but I don't mean that in this moment right now. What I'm saying is, I think because you do have a way through that she doesn't have, because she has this sort of false dichotomy between these two ideas that she can't reconcile. And I think at least I'm happy that we can, share a society where even you as an atheist or as a Christian, we're going to disagree about the foundation and the source and all those other kind of things, but at least we have a shared values system. And I think honestly, in the United States, in a constitutional republic, that was what the framers really envisioned, is that we could be a pluralistic society with a shared moral system tied to natural law kind of thinking, which is in disfavor, but essentially you're making observations about the natural world, making certain conclusions about what it works, what doesn't work. A lot of Thomas Paine's stuff was simply, hey, let everyone, it's a social experiment. Let some guy try it out. And if it doesn't work, then everyone should look at it and say, that didn't work. And we should not do that. It was very pragmatic in that sense. And so you have very much that kind of framework, which is at least compatible in many ways with a Christian worldview, even if we have our important differences and distinctions. And so, I think people should at least understand that is that, why Richard makes a good dialogue partner is not that we agree about everything and we're going to be honest about our disagreements. And this is sort of my big takeaway from all of this. Even though we have those, I think why you're a good conversation partner is that we can do that. We can kind of push back and say, I think you're wrong. You can say, I think I'm wrong, and all these sort of things. But we both have a moral framework that's going to say that shouldn't divide us at the core of who we are as at least citizens sharing this space or citizens of the world, or however everyone wants to frame it. We have a way of valuing others who are outside, who have different reasons and different motivations. I think ultimately it's going to, if too much of society is governed by, I think there's a percentage thing here. I think if 80% of the society shares your worldview with the atheist framework without God, I think eventually everything does shift. I would argue that as long as there's a Christian majority who grounded in that, as long as there's that minority of other viewpoints that have the shared moral system, I think society remains durable. It's like the argument that's made with Islam. As long as it remains a small minority within any community, there's no problems. But when it takes the majority and tries to impose Sharia or does these other things, then they become very radicalized very quickly, because that is ultimately what they do when they have the majority. It's a very different religious system, in other words, when it's in the minority versus when it's in the majority. And that's kind of the way I see it with our views. I think, as my honest assessment would be, as long as the atheist worldview that you share is the minority position, I think it's perfectly compatible within a Christian worldview framework, and it's going to all be healthy. But when Christianity is put in the minority,
it might actually,
we're going to see
it might actually work in interest. It might work in your interest actually to be in the minority. I actually think probably the strongest Christians were the first Christians, because they were beset on all sides. And now Christianity's facing this, we're dominant, but now it means anything. Now you've got Tucker Carlson Christianity and Candace Owens Christianity. So now you guys are facing a different kind of problem. But that first, I always like to say there was like maybe, I like to say, I think the Book of Acts says there was like maybe 120 original Christians. I bet you they were thick as thieves. I bet you that 120, if you asked one of them something, they would give you an answer. And if you asked the other one, he'd give you the same answer. I think the first batch were probably tighter than the Christians are now.
Yeah, that's very true. Any final thoughts for this show that you want to throw out? I mean, if that's final thought, that's great. Any kind of big ideas, and I'll let you have the final word on that.
Well, I had something I wanted to push back against you, and I do have a final thought. But if we only have time for one,
no, you can do I'm fine. You can do the pushback first. And
okay. What if in 5 years' time, 95% of Christianity idolizes Candace Owens, and she decides what Christianity means, and people go into churches and they bust up the church if it doesn't go according to what Candace Owens says? Are you going to hold tight, or are you going to get your Candace Owens Bible and try to keep up?
Well, I would reject that because the Candace Owens version of things is a distortion of what Christianity is.
I know.
Because there's a historic,
but I'm just
there's
saying,
historic truth there that I would say transcends
right.
any individual. Because see, to me, the consensus is not there. And this is why Christians have died historically for their beliefs, because they said, look, I don't go with the crowd. I transform culture. I don't bow to culture. Yeah.
And they did, the original Christians eventually, well, that network, it did transform culture. But I'm saying, what if Candace Owens transforms culture in a wrong way? She's objectively wrong. She's ontologically wrong. Jesus appears to you and says she's ontologically wrong. But 95% of the world of Christians now fully endorse and enforce what she says. Are you going to hold tight to your death? Or are you going to?
Oh, well, yeah, no, I'd hold tight to what I hold. I would hold tight to it now, regardless of, I've faced nothing in that drastic of a sense, but I've held to a lot of my standards on Christian marriage, trans issues for more than a decade on a lot of those things, and I've paid some social price for that over time in terms of reach on social media, the blacklisting, and that the shadow banning that took place, and I've taken a hit for those things over time. So not in, again, any extreme sense. It's a first world problem, so I'm not complaining. It's just, but God willing, I'd have the strength of conviction to stand firm for what I believe, regardless of the consequences. And I pray I never have to.
And I've seen you do it. I've seen you not only stand up to, left-wing pressure, but even Trump pressure, because sometimes Trump says, hey, I know what Christians think. This is what I think. And people have gone with him. And you said, no, I'm going to hold tight, even on Twitter, which you're not supposed to do that, but you did. My final thought is to atheists and Christians alike, everybody. The number one thing you should do is know what you're about. Know what behavior that you endorse and what behavior that you stand against and why, and then stick to it. Because, your enemies are going to come after you because of that. But you know who's also going to come after you? Your own side, because your own side's going to change, or some of it, enough of it's going to change that it's going to catch your attention. You're going to be like, could have sworn that would never have happened, but if it hasn't happened to you yet, it's going to happen. So know what you're about so that you can stand firm for what you believe and why. That's my final thought.
Well, hey, Richard, I appreciate you as a conversation partner. Leroy, sorry we lost you in this one. That does happen sometimes in our show when you're out traveling, but we wish you could have heard more from you. And again, thanks for everyone who joined us. And I want to encourage you to go out and raise the roof on economic justice by starting your own conversation with friends and family. In the meantime, please take a moment to rate the show on your favorite podcasting service and join us next month. We're going to explore the atheist ethic of citizenship and the morality of immigration.